Let me start with a fact that should stop you cold. A NATO country is being quietly threatened over its territory, not by Russia, not by China, but by the United States. While European leaders meet in Paris to defend Ukraine's sovereignty, the American president is openly questioning Denmark's control over Greenland, an autonomous territory, a NATO ally, a European landmass. This is not a diplomatic misunderstanding. It is a collision of power and dependence. I've watched global orders rise and fracture, and I can tell you this: when allies begin to fear their protector, history is already turning. Europe wants American strength, but it fears American anger. So it hesitates, it softens its words, it hopes the storm will pass. If you want to understand how power really works in the 21st century, stay with me. Because before we talk about Greenland, Ukraine, or Trump, we must confront the deeper problem Europe refuses to name. At its core, this is not a dispute about an island in the Arctic. It is a test of Europe's place in a world where power is once again blunt, unapologetic, and unevenly distributed. Europe faces a dilemma it has spent decades avoiding. It depends on the United States for security, intelligence, and military power. Yet it also claims to stand for sovereignty, rules, and restraint. When those two principles collide, something has to give. And increasingly, it is Europe's voice. The Greenland episode exposes that imbalance with brutal clarity. European leaders know that confronting Washington risks consequences for Ukraine, for NATO cohesion, for their own national security. So they calculate, they delay, they issue carefully worded statements that signal concern without confrontation. This is not weakness of character, it is weakness of structure. A continent built on consensus is struggling in an era of coercion. To understand how Europe arrived at this point, we have to step back into history, into alliances, and into the long cycle that shaped Europe's dependence in the first place. To understand this moment, we have to rewind the clock. Europe's dependence did not happen overnight. It was built deliberately after catastrophe. After two world wars that shattered the continent, European nations made a conscious trade-off: sovereignty for stability, autonomy for protection. The United States became the guarantor. NATO became the shield. Europe focused on rebuilding economies, expanding welfare states, and binding former rivals together through integration. It worked spectacularly for decades, but there was a hidden cost. Security was outsourced. Hard power was deferred. Strategic muscle slowly atrophied. While Europe perfected rules and norms, Washington retained the aircraft carriers, the intelligence networks, the command structures. The Cold War froze this arrangement in place. And when it ended, Europe assumed history had settled in its favor. But power never disappears. It waits. Now, as global competition returns in Ukraine, in the Arctic, in Venezuela, the old bargain is being tested. And Europe is discovering that dependence, once locked in, is painfully hard to escape. The first real shock came not in theory, but in crisis. The shock arrived quietly and then all at once. In Paris, European leaders gathered to keep the United States committed to Ukraine's survival. The war, they were told, was 90% of the way to a deal. No one wanted to disrupt that fragile balance. And then reality intruded. Washington intervened militarily in Venezuela. Its president was taken into custody. And almost immediately, the American president repeated a claim that stunned European capitals: we need Greenland. Not as a joke, not as a bargaining chip, but as a matter of national security. Suddenly, the abstract became concrete. Europe was no longer watching sovereignty violated elsewhere. It was watching the rules bend inside its own alliance. European leaders scrambled for language. A statement emerged, cautious and delayed, affirming that Greenland's future belonged to Denmark and Greenland alone. But the damage was already done. If sovereignty can be questioned without consequence inside NATO, then the crisis is no longer external. It is structural, And it forces an uncomfortable question. What exactly restrains power when restraint is no longer convenient? What lies beneath this crisis is not impulse. It is a system quietly revealing its logic. The United States views security through capability and control. Geography matters, assets matter, and in that calculus, Greenland is not a community or a constitutional arrangement. It is a strategic platform, Arctic access, missile defense, great power competition. Europe, by contrast, views security through legitimacy and law. Sovereignty is a principle. Alliances are commitments. Power is constrained by process. These two worldviews once complemented each other. Now they collide, because when power is asymmetric, rules depend on enforcement, and enforcement depends on who holds leverage. Europe does not. Washington knows this. It knows Europe relies on American intelligence, airlift, command structures. It knows that confrontation carries costs. Europe is not prepared to pay. So pressure works not loudly, but effectively. This is why Greenland matters. Not for what may happen there, but for what it proves. That dependence transforms alliances into negotiations and principles into preferences. The second shock would make that reality impossible to ignore. The second shock was not rhetorical. It was psychological. After Venezuela, after Greenland, European officials began asking questions they rarely voice aloud, not in public, not even easily in private. What if Washington acts first and consults later? What if loyalty is no longer reciprocal, but conditional? Behind closed doors, the discomfort was palpable. Statements of unity rang hollow. Silence from Europe's largest capitals spoke louder than any declaration. No tanks moved, no bases changed hands, and yet something fundamental shifted. Because deterrence is not just military, it is mental. It relies on shared assumptions about restraint. Those assumptions cracked when a senior White House official confidently stated that no one would fight the United States over Greenland. It wasn't a threat, it was an observation, a reminder of the hierarchy everyone already knew. Europe realized the danger was not invasion, it was irrelevance. A world where power decides first and explanations come later leaves little room for consensus-based actors. And that realization is far more destabilizing than any single crisis. And this is where it stops being abstract. This is where it reaches you. Because when alliances weaken, it is not institutions that feel the shock first. It is people, citizens, voters, workers, families. You are told that NATO protects you, that the EU defends your interests, that the rules-based order keeps you safe. And most days, that feels true. Until suddenly, it doesn't. When powerful states test boundaries, uncertainty seeps into everyday life. Energy prices, defense spending, political trust, the quiet anxiety that the world is becoming harsher, faster, less predictable. You may never visit Greenland, but decisions about it shape the security guarantees behind your borders. And here is the hardest truth. Dependence feels comfortable until it becomes visible. Europe's hesitation is not strategic abstraction. It is a signal to its citizens that protection may come with conditions, that values may bend under pressure. If this makes you uneasy, it should. Because the future of security is not decided in speeches. It is decided in moments when silence feels safer than speaking. And that silence carries a cost. Beyond Europe, the shockwaves travel fast. Allies and adversaries are watching carefully. In Moscow, Beijing, and beyond, Greenland is not seen as an isolated dispute. It is read as a signal, a measure of how far American power can stretch and how quietly Europe will accommodate it. For Russia, the Arctic is already a contested frontier. Any fracture inside NATO weakens deterrence. Any hesitation invites testing. For China, which has steadily expanded its Arctic ambitions, Europe's uncertainty confirms a familiar lesson. Alliances matter, but power matters more. Even smaller states are recalibrating. If sovereignty inside NATO is negotiable, then security guarantees everywhere look conditional. This is how global order erodes, not through collapse, but through reinterpretation, through moments when rules remain on paper, yet lose force in practice. The danger is not that the world becomes lawless overnight. It is that norms become optional for the powerful and aspirational for everyone else. And when that happens, the future no longer belongs to those who cooperate best, but to those who pressure hardest. The question is where this path leads next. From here, Europe faces three possible futures. None are theoretical. All are already forming. The first is adaptation. Europe closes ranks, speaks with one voice, and slowly reduces its security dependence on Washington. It invests seriously in defense, intelligence, and strategic autonomy. Alliances remain, but on more balanced terms. This path is difficult, expensive, and politically risky, but it restores credibility. The second is drift. Europe continues managing crises as they come, avoiding confrontation, issuing statements, hoping each shock is the last. NATO survives, the EU endures. But authority erodes quietly, dependence deepens, and leverage shifts further away from Brussels. The third is rupture. A future crisis forces a direct choice between principle and protection, between sovereignty and security. And Europe discovers too late that hesitation has costs it cannot control. History offers no guarantees, but it offers a warning. Systems that delay hard choices rarely avoid them. The future will not be decided by intention, but by preparation. And Europe's moment of decision is approaching faster than it appears. So let me leave you with this. Greenland is not the story. Trump is not the story. Even NATO, in the narrow sense, is not the story. The story is this. Power has returned to the center of global politics, and Europe is still speaking the language of a world that no longer exists. For decades, Europe believed that interdependence would tame ambition, that rules would restrain force, that alliances would always align values with interests. Those beliefs were not foolish, they were earned, but they are no longer sufficient. When power shifts, silence becomes a choice. When dependence deepens, hesitation becomes a signal. Europe now stands at a crossroads, not between America and autonomy, but between preparation and denial. The question is not whether Europe will remain allied with the United States. It will. The question is whether it will remain a serious actor within that alliance, because in the 21st century, respect is not declared. It is demonstrated. If you want to understand where this new world is heading and what comes next for Europe, NATO, and global order, stay with me. This conversation is only beginning.